What's up guys, welcome back to Elderwood Games. Thomas here, and today I have 11 things that I want to see in 11th edition. Let me know if you agree with these down in the comments below. Starting with the first one, I would love to see them better delineate the different levels of play in Warhammer 40,000. Basically having a tournament play, a matched play, and then an open play. Basically that way we can better kind of separate when we should be using the tournament companion versus using, challengers or the twist cards and that sort of thing. Tournament play would obviously be the strictest form of this, where it would be everything is played by the tournament companion rules. Matched play would effectively be tournament play, but outside of a tournament setting. This way you can get your tester or, test games, that sort of thing, your practice rounds before the tournaments in a more casual setting where you wouldn't have the time restrictions that are usually in tournament play. And the last would be open play. So open play would basically be you can use any supplements or anything like that, but for the most part it's meant to be more of a narrative focused or a more casual focused sort of environment where you can use, challenger cards, twist cards, any terrain layouts, more thematic terrain. Just because what I've kind of seen happen, at least in my local shop, is that a lot of us tend to just not use challenger cards or not use twist cards just because when we're playing against, each other, a lot of us are different skill levels, and then that way it feels more balanced, but it only feels that way because it feels like that's what Games Workshop is promoting as being the most balanced way to play. So I would just like to see maybe a little bit more of a delineation, and then that way, you could say, hey, I'm looking for an open play game. I'd like to use challengers and twists, which you can kind of do now, but it just feels like some players are more against that for some reason. Next on my list is Battle Shock. This is one that I know a lot of creators have talked about as well, and it's just one that I think is very difficult to put a real beat on, because we have a lot of armies that really want Battle Shock to happen. You have Tyranids. Obviously I want that updated because I play Tyranids, but then you also have some of the Chaos Space Marine legions that like and interact well with Battle Shock, and then you also have stuff like the Blood Angels, which interact with Battle Shock in a more unique way where they kind of want to be Battle Shocked. I think we just need to figure out a easier way for Battle Shock to be put on any unit, just because right now, if you're playing into Space Marines, you're not Battle Shocking them unless your opponent is just having a horrific dice roll day. It's kind of crazy how few Space Marines I've ever been able to Battle Shock, and being a more terror army where that's part of, I get bonuses from Battle Shock with quite a few units. It would be nice to have it be more of a, like, you can just put Battle Shock on something, or it's something that feels a bit more daunting. I think losing OC is great. I think losing the ability to target with stratagems is good. I'd like to see maybe something else that is more of a clear benefit from outside forces, +1 to hit, -1 to wound, some of those kind of things where it feels more like the unit is suffering from being frightened on the battlefield and not able to stand their ground. So I would just like to see maybe a little bit of an update to the Battle Shock mechanic, and maybe some updates to armies that care about Battle Shock that would basically be able to benefit more from the new ruling and that sort of thing. Next up is some form of regular detachment releases or updates. I really like what they did last year with Grotmus. I think that was just a great way to bring a lot of people in, have a lot of fun detachments get released. Obviously we saw stuff like Mordaka and some of the other ones that really ended just pulling ahead and being ultimately the best detachment for the faction, which is just going to happen with power creep and that sort of thing. You see it in other games as well when you have this sort of release schedule over the years. But then they also promised quarterly detachment updates where we were supposed to get detachments every quarter. Obviously the last 2 quarters got released during Grotmus this year in 2025, but I think I would either want to see that quarterly release schedule with them. It would give some of the detachments that may be later in the release schedules something to look forward to throughout the edition, or have it be strictly a Grotmus thing and just have it be every Grotmus we get you know, every faction gets a new detachment, and you could do that with 40k and AOS. I feel like that would be a bit more fun. And then if they want to do the lore stuff, maybe have writers write lore based on the detachments they're releasing. And then you could even have it be, you know, Tyranids and Space Marines get something, and the lore be about a battle between Tyranids and Space Marines. And I think that could be really cool. You could have flavorful detachments that are synced with this story lore, so that way players can immediately be like, oh yeah, this is because of the battle for X planet, battle against X Hive fleet, that sort of thing. And it could be really thematic and fun, and then that would also make it easier to release multiple attachments on a single day. Since we have like 27 some odd actual factions, we're gonna have to double up on some, and I think that could be a really cool and unique way to do it. This one is a bit more of a administrative update, but I think we should consider pushing into a 4-year release cycle, or have all the codexes released within the first 2 years. Basically, that last year between the editions should be minimal, you know, no new codexes. All the codexes should be released, keep the extra detachments and that sort of thing, but basically have this last year be everybody has their codex, everyone has multiple detachments they can play, and the only thing that gets released are, you know, maybe some new models, some new units, but it could also allow for that final year to be some testing ground for the following edition. So that way we get a year's worth of massive play testing that could help better the future years. Obviously there's a little bit of that, right? Like, they're going to implement something in 11th edition that's going to be more fulfilled in 12th edition, just like there's likely things in 10th edition that they've implemented in hopes to better it for 11th edition and then moving forward. But having effectively a year of play that is dedicated to the betterment of the following edition would allow each edition to have a more coherent initial release. So that way it's not, hey, here's the new core rules, 3 weeks later, hey, here's the updated core rules because some things weren't right. And then, you know, it's halfway through the edition and they're finally like, okay, there's not going to be any major rules updates going forward. What you see is what you get, and that sort of thing. Just my thoughts. I think it'd be cool to see a wider release schedule, so that way, you know, we can still have the pace that it goes now, which I think is fine, but I do want to see those later codex releases basically have more time to play with their actual codex instead of being stuck in index for so long. Next is another rules update. I'd like to see some change to the terrain and cover rules. I think the rulings, you know, giving the +1 save is fine, but I would like to see terrain feel a bit more useful and it not just be ruins all the time. Obviously this is a bit more of a tournament thing, and I know I spoke a little bit earlier about kind of the different levels of play, but I think what comes into play is there's a lot of questions surrounding terrain. I feel like that's the thing I have to explain to newer players more and more, is just how you interact with terrain. What I would like to see is just more clear rulings on that. To be honest, I think line of sight should be determined by the base and the hull, obviously, if they don't have a base. I get the whole, like, the unit is actually abstractly where the models are, so if any part of the model can be seen, you can shoot it. The issue is that Games Workshop makes more and more models that are taller and wider and just more expressive. So then it's like, because my Von Ryan's Leapers have this one claw that reaches out way higher than the rest, I can be seen, you know, through ruins and that sort of thing because they're just peeking out just a bit, and that model is able to be shot when it really shouldn't be because it's in cover, it's hiding behind a wall. So I would just like to see maybe some tweaks in the terrain department, make cover feel a bit more realized. Honestly, I know I've spoken before about how much I like the terrain mats, but as I've stopped playing with them, I actually find that it's more of a satisfying game. And I think that rules updating would be better for that, instead of just the tournament companion implementing these terrain mats to make it just be something that fully blocks line of sight. I think if we had better terrain that is meant to be line of sight blocking, it would be a more unique experience. And instead of having, you know, these like squares all laid out across the board, you just have more thematic looking terrain. And, you know, we can do the rubber band rule where we don't need the actual mats. We can just have the terrain set up in a way that it creates the floor, and every player disagrees and that sort of thing. And it would just, I feel like it would strip away some of the confusion between that. And then also it would make the transition from open play into tournament play and tournament play into open play a lot easier, because you're not gaining the mats and you're not losing the mats, kind of going back and forth. So it's just overall, that's how terrain works in every regard. And there's no real excess outside of it. And players are going to be able to have better language between one another of how terrain should work. And then there's not the questions of, oh, does this wall have windows? Does this not have windows? And those sorts of things that kind of come up because of how they kind of wrote themselves into corners in 10th edition. Next up is unique data slates or points increases for upgraded weapons. Ultimately, what I would prefer is extra data slates or data sheets for the different war gears. Kind of like what they did with the crisis suits. I feel like that's a really effective way of how they did the war gear, because basically now they took all the different weapons options that crisis suits have had throughout the editions and basically made them into 3 separate categories. And now each of those 3 have very unique rules that play into the specific weapons that they have. So you have the Sunforged suits, which got the melta-guns, and they get to reroll wounds and damage into monsters and vehicles, which is what those weapons want to do. Then you have your Star Scythe suits, which have the burst cannons and the flamers, which want to be going into infantry. And then they also get additional AP when not shooting at monsters and vehicles. So they have rules that benefit them shooting into infantry. And then lastly, you have the Fire Knives, which are kind of in between. They're sort of the elite hunters, and they have the plasma rifles and missile pods, and they get full rerolls to hit into full strength units, and then rerolls of 1s to hit into below full strength units. As you can see, it went from being able to play just the crisis suits and have them kitted however you want, into, hey, these are 3 different unique subsets of the crisis suits that are specifically designed to cater to the different weapons that you put onto them. Now, obviously, there's not a lot of units that have the level of customization that crisis suits have had. So being able to do this across the board into this almost over-exaggerated way is not very likely. But for units that are like guardsmen that can, be upgraded into las rifles, or for like Sisters of Battles, being able to get plasma pistols and that sort of thing, basically making it to where you can have this enhanced or heavy weapon squad to be able to be costed a bit more, but then you get more of those higher weapons. And they could also have those things that are like rerolls to wound, rerolls to damage, and that sort of thing, to make them be able to punch all that bit harder and make that extra points be even more valuable, would be an interesting way to do it. Now, obviously, because it doesn't really work across the board, I'm not necessarily against them adding in, buying war gear, but I would want it to be very minimal, that you're only paying for those better weapons, instead of it being something like in Horus Heresy, where you basically pay for bayonets on every guy. You have to pay for each individual weapon, a lot of the time, each individual upgrade, and it just becomes very taxing. It's nice in some ways because you can almost guarantee that you're going to meet exactly your points limits, but because it's so granular, it feels like you have so much wiggle room. And if something were to change mid-edition, it could completely just nullify how you've built your army. So WYSIWYG kind of builds would be honestly a bit more difficult, and you would likely see less and less WYSIWYG as the edition goes on, because people build in a certain way and they're not going to rebuild into the new way because of how frequent the changes are. Basically, I'd like to either see them move into creating more unique data sheets for weapon upgrades, or only have specific weapon upgrades be point costed, and basically the squad be points based on their minimal loadout. One thing that I think that was great about the chapter approved for the end of this edition has been the more narrative missions, the asymmetric missions, as well as the twists and challenger cards. But focusing on the mission side of it, I would love to see them expand the asymmetric missions and have more of a narrative missions focused part of the deck. I think we saw a few of that in this year's Grotmas. So we had sort of the network relay one where certain objective markers were turned off on certain turns while other ones were turned on. So you could only score kind of every other turn on stuff, making it more important to kind of divvy up your forces across the field instead of just hunkering down on single objectives. And then you also saw, I know this one was more for AOS, but the Red Gobbo's Heist, where you kind of have to, one team is helping him across and the other team is trying to stop him across. Having these extraction based missions I think could be a lot of fun, and basically having an objective marker that moves across the battlefield while the defending player is holding on to it and that sort of thing, I think could be a lot of fun and provide a more unique way to play 40K. And of course, this would just be in more of the open play scenario I spoke about earlier. The tournament play would use the standard mission deck, but then having these like more unique and fun missions that you can play with your friends, where it's just different than just standing on circles. You have an ulterior mission, you have extra primary mission kind of stuff, and I think that would be a lot of fun. Next up, I spoke just a second ago about challenger cards and sort of updating the mission deck. I do think that we need some form of catch-up mechanic. It can be restricted and out of the tournament play. I'm fine with that. I know tournament players, a lot of them don't like the catch-up idea and the catch-up mechanics, and I can kind of understand that. But also, I don't really understand that because I feel like when you're playing at such a high level, you should want your opponent to be able to match you along the way and have it be closer games that are ultimately more fun. Being able to do that in a way through the rules would make it a lot easier for, you know, some newer players to be able to get into the tournament scene and actually feel like they can compete against some of these better players. But ultimately what I would like to see is just an updated challenger card variant or some other catch-up mechanic that we can use to basically be able to help players that fall behind. As I started out, I was very much in need of those catch-up mechanics. Now that I'm winning a bit more and able to play more competitively against the better players of my shop, you know, it's something that I think it would still be beneficial to the game as a whole, being able to have those catch-up games, because honestly, sometimes you will have a bad start and you'll fall behind pretty quickly, and you may be playing against an army that is better at primary and secondary scoring than you. So being able to catch up is almost impossible. And while I do now believe more that you should still play until turn 5, having the ability to have these catch-up mechanics, even if it just closes the gap, would just be ultimately a better feeling game for everyone involved. Next up is a bit of a quality of life improvement. I think I would love to see either a new app by Games Workshop that supports Crusade, or just adding in the features into the Warhammer 40,000 app. As you create the army roster in the app, basically have a checkbox that says Crusade, so you can check that, and then when you move into there, basically you can have each unit, you can name the unit, and then give them their battle scars, their honors, and that sort of thing. Keep track of their XP even would be cool. Obviously there's a lot of things that can be overhauled in the app, but I do think that implementing the Crusade rules and being able to create Crusade lists within the app, which a lot of players, at least at my shop, use the Warhammer 40,000 app as their main way to track everything, I think it would just be ultimately an overall improvement. I know I have forgotten so many times about my Crusade bonuses and my Crusade negatives while I've been playing, because, you know, I'm keeping track of multiple data sheets. I have multiple of duplicate units that are difficult to kind of track between, and it just ends up being very taxing. And I feel like having it in one place where everything's written out and you can kind of more easily reference what each of them are, instead of having to have like your shorthand or have your Crusade books ready and available and that sort of thing. I just think that would be an ideal upgrade and a nice quality of life improvement for some of us more narrative and Crusade players. A little bit of a perpendicular thought on the Warhammer app. This is probably one that isn't going to happen, but relating to codexes, I think a Warhammer Plus subscription should give you access to all codexes, and then the codexes in general, I think, should pivot to be more of a art and lore book. Definitely still have the data sheets and everything like that. Not saying that it shouldn't, but because there are almost immediate updates to codexes, at least in 10th edition, there were so many that were basically updated before they actually became legitimate, that it just makes no sense that we're paying out the wazoo for these books. And if, you know, it's not just the Warhammer Plus subscription that gives you access to all codexes, I think that there should be a digital option that you can either do through the app or through Warhammer Plus to basically say you pay a reduced price, you just get access to all the data sheets, the attachments, and all that jazz. And of course, the Warhammer app gets updated every time with the releases and the data slate updates. That way, a little bit less wallet fatigue. And then while I do like having the codexes on my shelf, and I likely would still buy the codexes for my armies, it just gives some players a little bit of an easier option to get into the game instead of basically spending money they could have bought a kit with on a book that is going to be immediately useless. Basically, Warhammer Plus should either give us access to all the codex releases within the app or give us the option to buy digitally the codex rules, so that way we don't spend money on a print book when we can just have the digital rules. The last thing on my list of wishes for 11th edition is Combat Patrol Overhaul. So obviously in AOS you have Spearhead, which is a really great version, a smaller version of AOS, and a lot of fun, and it's gained a ton of traction and actually brought a lot of people out of 40K into AOS because you can just buy the box and have a very satisfying game with just what's in the contents of that box set. Whereas Combat Patrol, a lot of times, even though I do hear kind of our shop pushing those, it's almost always just for the value. It's not about playing the smaller game. And most of us even talk about, like, we would just match the points of the Combat Patrol instead of playing the Combat Patrol version because it just is easier and makes more sense and is ultimately more fun. I think if we were to push Combat Patrol more into that Spearhead direction, I think that it would be ultimately beneficial and it would feel more like a complete game. So that way players may not be as encouraged to, push themselves into 1,000 points to start. And I think it would just kind of help with some of that feeling of some players just refusing to play Combat Patrol or smaller than 1,000 point games. I know my shop is actually really open to playing small point games. I've played as low as like 250 points. I know I spoke about that in my league video a little bit. I've played all across those because everyone starts somewhere, and I would much rather a player get an idea of how their army plays and figure out if they enjoy this hobby when they've only bought a Combat Patrol instead of getting to 1,000 points, spending all that money, and then realizing like, actually, I don't really like this faction, or I don't really like this game, and I would rather play AOS or something along those lines. Those are kind of my thoughts on what I'd like to see for 11th edition. And yeah, just let me know if you agree with any of these or disagree down in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in